Hello, my name's Tom Walker. Welcome to That'll Be the Day, which is the new name I'm giving to my podcasts. I hope you like it. And if you like the sound of the music at the start of the podcast, it's taken from a track called That'll Be the Day by the Liverpool band The Vow. Anyone who knows me will know that the issue of employment opportunities for visually impaired people is one that's close to my heart. According to the RNIB statistics, 75% of blind and partially sighted people are unemployed. So when I saw a post on Facebook addressing this very issue, I thought I must speak to the author. And the person who wrote it is Claire Randall. Claire is visually impaired, and I hope she's on the other end of this Zoom call now. Claire, are you there?
I am. How are you?
I'm all right, thank you. How are you? How was Christmas and New Year?
It was quiet, which kind of works. You tend to spend a lot of money at Christmas. I didn't spend a huge amount. So, yeah, it was very quiet.
We'll get on to employment shortly. But the one thing I do want to ask you about, first of all, as I said in the little introduction there, 75%, or at least it's estimated that around 75% of visually impaired people are unemployed. Do you think that statistic is accurate?
I think it is accurate that 75% of people with a visual impairment are unemployed. I would be interested to know how many of those people also have additional disabilities, which might contribute to that statistic.
All right, well, we'll talk a little bit more about employment in a while, but I just thought it might be interesting, first of all, for people to find out a little bit more about you, where you grew up and your education. So give us a little pen portrait of Claire Randall, if you would, please.
Okay, well, I was born in Swindon in Wiltshire. And then when I was a tiny baby, so I was 6 weeks old, my parents moved to Zambia in Africa. And then we moved to Botswana. Then we came back when I was nearly 5 to UK. And I went to school over here in Exeter until I was 9 in 1983. We moved back to South Africa. And we lived there first in a little town called Hermanus, which is like a little seaside town, sort of place where you get whales in the bay in the summer and that kind of thing. And then my parents moved up to a place called Aronyment, which is a diamond mine just on the Namibian border. And we lived there until 1993. I had to think about that then, until 1993. And then we came back. And in the meantime, I was educated in South Africa, both in English and Afrikaans. And I did what they call a matric qualification, which is equivalent to A-levels. And then I also did a telephony qualification, as was the norm back then. And then I came over here and then I started looking for work. I didn't educate myself beyond that.
When you were at school in South Africa, did you go to a mainstream school or what we would call a special school?
No, I went to a specialist school. And in fact, it was the only one in the country for... dare I say, it was the only one in the country for white children with a visual impairment. And so I went there. And it was in a place called Worcester, and very, very heavily Afrikaans speaking as opposed to English. So I'm actually fully bilingual, which you would never guess from my accent.
What was your preferred medium when you were at school? Was it all available to you?
Yeah, it very much was. I actually started learning Braille in the UK. And then I went over there and obviously, you continue to learn Braille. I very much had Braille. And then I learned to touch type when I was probably about 11. But Braille was always a means by which we did all our exams and we could type our answers, but we all had the ability to write and read Braille fluently. And it wasn't considered an option. You had to do it. And even the children who came over who were losing their sight, the partially sighted kind of transitioning to blind, were obligated to learn Braille.
And when you were at school, was there an expectation that you as a visually impaired student would move on either to university or into paid employment?
Yes, very much so. South Africa is a lot more different than the UK in that there's no benefit system. There's nothing to fall back on. So you either get a job or unless you have family who will support you, you starve. So it was very much a consideration that if you had the aptitude to go to university, you went to university. And if you didn't, if you went on to do, like a telephony course or piano tuning course, that you would then move on to paid employment. And there were a lot of companies across the country who were known for employing, say, blind telephonists. And because they knew, it was almost like a network. That I went for a couple of interviews for companies where essentially they were looking for a blind person because it had previously been a blind person that had worked there. And so the communication came back. And you very much went into a job. It wasn't considered the norm to leave school and then not work for a living. And of course, there are people who don't for various reasons, but it was the expectation. There was never an expectation that you not work.
Were you a bit nervous as you approached the end of your schooling that you might be one of those unfortunate people who did end up without work? And if you did consider that, what did you think would happen to you?
No, actually, I wasn't. I very much, it was always very much I'll leave school and then I'll get a job. It was never a thought because all my friends left school and got jobs or went to university, but I didn't know anyone really who was unemployed unless some girls left school and got married and had babies, which wasn't on my agenda at that point. And so very much so children left school and went into work, even if it was, as a telephonist. And don't get me wrong, a telephonist job I'm not downgrading that. But obviously there are some people that would think, it was only a telephonist, but it's not. It's very much a worthwhile job, even though those jobs are much fewer and far between now. But no, it was never an issue. It was never a consideration. And even when I came back here, I just thought, there'll be jobs and I'll apply for one and I'll get one. It never occurred to me that it would be a struggle.
You've half anticipated my next question because at the age of 21, if my maths are correct, you moved back to the UK. And how did you find the attitude towards you as a visually impaired person? How did it compare with the attitude in South Africa, particularly where employment is concerned?
It was very much a case of you were on your own in terms of looking for work. I went to the job centre and I spoke to the then disability employment advisor, and she was like, yeah, we can send you jobs. And the kind of jobs she would send me for things like filing clerks and, those kind of jobs which you couldn't possibly do. I used to go through the paper with, a parent or whatever every week, and you would ring up, and back then there was no Disability Discrimination Act. So you would ring and you would say, okay, well, I'm applying for this job. I would just like to let you know I'm blind. And they would almost immediately clam up. Oh, well, sorry, we can't, accommodate you on that score. And by the time I'd been over here for about 8 months, I would say, I'd kind of lost the will to live, really, and not literally, but, I'd kind of thought, I thought at that point I would have a job and I'd be earning something. And the crunch came when a friend of my aunt said, well, we're looking for people. I work for this company, or I know this person that works for this company. It's doing telesales, selling double glazing. And you could go for an interview there, which I did. And I'm fairly eloquent, so I do tend to come across quite well in interview. And I went to work for them, and they said, I don't know how we're going to manage the accessibility bit. And I said, well, how do you deal with people ringing? She said, well, we give them all numbers, and they all take a few pages, and then they ring these customers. I said, so what if I took pages home and a family member read them out and I could braille them? Now, of course, now that would be in complete contravention of GDPR, but back then it was perfectly acceptable. And so that's what I did. And then beyond that, I was recommended a job for a company called Allied Dunbar, who are now Zurich PLC. And they were specifically looking to recruit a disabled person. And because by then I'd had a job, it was very much the adage of once you've had a job, it's a lot easier to get a job. Whereas before, nobody would take me seriously. So I went to work for them, and I worked for them for several years and beyond. I'll go into the rest beyond that.
Not only are you very eloquent, you're very good at anticipating my questions as well, Claire. Because I was going to ask you, just to briefly outline your employment history for us. Tell us what the types of things you've done. You don't need to tell us about every job, but give us a little idea of the jobs you've done. You've obviously told us about a couple of them already.
Yeah. Okay. So Allied Dunbar, we'll omit the telesales, but I did that. And then Allied Dunbar, I worked as a secretary / audio typist, and then they moved to an open plan area, and I joined their call centre, their internal call centre, dealing with financial advisor queries. And then I moved to the AA in their car insurance department, and that was in Cardiff. And then I left them and I went back to Swindon and I went to work for the Natural Environment Research Council, firstly as a finance administrator. And that was dealing with basically contracts which the organisation awards to universities and faculties to do with research into the natural environment. And we had to deal with the invoices and the balancing of the finances. And then I was promoted to finance manager, and in the same thing, but with more specific areas. So I worked in Earth observation, and that's basically, when you hear about them sending up pieces of kit on satellites to look at the weather and the phenomenons on the Earth and the Earth's crust, that was the kind of stuff that we funded. So I kind of tell people I literally worked in rocket science, but I didn't really. But it was all to do with the funding of it. And then I left to go on maternity leave, and after that, it was all voluntary. I worked as I volunteered on the PTA. I also volunteered in my son's school, going in and listening to children's read. And I was firstly a governor and then chair of governors. And then I left there when I moved here to Orpington. And after that, I started looking for work, and I've kind of been looking ever since, but I had a period of illness in the middle that I can go into if at some point, which kind of hampered my search process. And then since then, I've applied for numerous jobs. I was offered a job last year. I was actually offered an interview last year, and they basically said that when they found out I was blind, they said, "Oh yeah, well, what if the system's not accessible? Then we can't, then we'll have deprived someone else of the opportunity that could have done the job otherwise, so we're not going to interview you." And then I went for an interview and got offered the job again for a company back in Swindon, and they couldn't make their systems accessible, so that job was withdrawn. I was offered the job in October 2019, and the job offer was withdrawn in April of the next year.
Before we talk about the accessibility issues, another question occurs to me, because you've obviously had a lot of success in relation to employment. You've found jobs when you've needed to find them, up until now at least. What was the secret of your success, do you think?
I think I'm quite tenacious. So I'm very much, I don't give up very easily. And, for every one job that you get, there are obviously the rejections, but I'm very pragmatic. I'm very much of the view that, you apply for a job, and if you can get as far as interview, then you're on a level playing field as far as I'm concerned. And I also steer well clear of the view that some do hold that says, "Oh, I won't get a job because I'm blind. And if they get a rejection, it was because they were blind." When actually you might apply for a job and be interviewed for it, and you just weren't the best candidate at the time. So I very much move forward. If I get a rejection, then I just move on and apply for the next job. And I believe I do come across well in interview, which is why I think that once I can get to the interview process, if I am the best candidate for the job, then there's no reason why they can't give it to me.
It's very interesting that you mentioned that, because probably about 20 or 30 years ago, if I'd been rejected, I would have been really quite angry and probably thought about, "Oh, well, that's discrimination, etc., etc." Whereas now I kind of think, well, it wasn't meant to be. Would I really want to work for an organisation that may have discriminated against me? So my perception and my perspective has changed over the years. And I think that's probably, I don't know what you think, but I think that's probably about the only healthy way to proceed with it, really.
It is really. And also I've been involved in interviewing people. So I've seen it from the other side. There are people that I wouldn't employ that may have had disabilities, but their disability has nothing to do with it. I just wouldn't have employed them even if they didn't have a disability. And so, yes, I do think you do have to step away from this notion that you're going to be discriminated against. I think there's a real risk that if you walk into an interview with the point that you're, with the view that you're going to be discriminated against, you run the risk of walking in kind of with a chip on your shoulder already. And that's not going to stand you in very good stead at the end of the day.
It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, I guess.
It does, very much so, yeah.
Moving on to the point you were making in the post I saw on Facebook, could you summarise the point you were making there for us, Claire?
I'm now looking for work after my last job offer was withdrawn. I decided to apply for Universal Credit because it puts me in touch with the job centre. And I I applied for them and was basically signposted to the job centre. They got in touch, and she said, "Oh yes. Well, what are you doing to look for work?" Now, in the meantime, I'm obviously looking at companies like the civil service and Indeed and various other, wherever there are job applications. Those are the places I look. She said, "Oh yes, very good. Okay, well what we'll do is I'll refer you to Reed Employment, and I'll be in touch in a couple of weeks." So I had a phone call from Reed the week after, saying, "Oh yes, welcome on board, and we'll send you a document and stuff like that, and we'll arrange a follow up." Had all this, you must commit to this and kind of thing document, and then I had an email from them about 3 or 4 days later saying, "We're very sorry, but we're not actually taking referrals in your area. We wish you luck in your endeavours to find work." And in the meantime, the woman from the job centre rang me back, and she said, "Oh, yes, hello, how are you?" And the conversation kind of went along the lines of, "How are you?" I said, "I'm fine." I said, "Just to let you know that Reed have told me they're not taking referrals anymore." And she went, "Who?" And I said, "Reed Employment, you referred me to them." "Oh, yeah. Well, thanks for letting me know. Have you looked for any jobs?" I said, "Yeah, I've looked for a couple." I said, "But it is December and it's, obviously it's quite a time at the moment." Yes, January." "Okay, well, you've taken my call. Goodbye." And that was it. That's the last I've heard from them. So I haven't exactly had a great experience with them. Our job centre doesn't have a disability employment officer. And so it's kind of been a bit of an eye-opener. But a lot of people said, "Oh, you must do this and they'll help you and they'll, give you work," and all that kind of thing. And I thought, well, no ventured really, and I haven't gained. So I'm back to looking on websites and the civil service and everywhere else that is employing. And hopefully the job market will pick up in the next few months, but the pandemic hasn't helped. And that's unfortunately the case for everyone at this point.
It strikes me, from not just listening to your story, but talking to other people, that there's very little official help out there for visually impaired people who are actually looking for employment. Would that be your perception?
Yeah, that very much is my perception. There's not very much help from the government. Dare I say, there's not very much help from the visual impairment charities. They talk the talk, but as we know, unfortunately, many of them don't have particularly good records in terms of the number of visually impaired people they personally employ. It is very much you're out on your own. And I remember when I actually first came home, I rang one of the visual impairment charities and I said, because in South Africa, it was kind of like, are there places that specifically employ blind people, and you knew who they were. So I rang this charity and I said, "Are there people, in the UK, I've got this telephone aid qualification, and can you tell me?" And she went, "Well, it's not our job to tell you how to find a job. You'll have to go and look for one on your own." And that's never improved. And there have been the odd job focus group and seminar and things, but they never actually come to anything. So I think, unfortunately, it is very much a single person thing, everybody out for themselves, really, unfortunately.
And one of the things that strikes me about many of the visual impairment organisations, both local and national, is that they don't understand the practicalities of applying for a job, and that the challenges that they impose on disabled people, and particularly visually impaired people.
No, they very much don't. And I think it's one of those where you should apply for jobs and apply for this and that, and you could be applying. How are you applying? And a lot of the application processes aren't awfully accessible. We are now in a position where a lot more employment is online. A lot more of the applications are online, and so they are better than they were. But certainly back in the day, when it was all paper application forms, you really had to have someone to help you through that application process. And that was before you actually got into the workplace, and having to be the one who advocates for accessible technology, and in an environment where employers are told that they're not allowed to ask about your disability at interview. And therefore, if you don't offer up the information, they don't have any idea. So it's a real difficult one. And there's very little understanding from anyone on that score. It's very much, you tend to find that people speak to each other rather than to the charities.
It's interesting you mentioned about paper-based application forms. I remember the first job I got. My brother David filled in the form for me. So yeah, I can empathise with that very much. I want to talk about accessibility in a minute, but before I do that, I just wanted to ask you this: what do you think needs to change to help people like you, visually impaired people, to apply for work? What should the charities and government be doing that they're not doing right now?
The government need to make more disability employment accessible. So they need to bring in more disability employment staff into their job centres with training and understanding. And if necessary, those people need to be disabled because they have first-hand empathy and understanding of the process and what it's like. They need to then be able to kind of liaise with companies. The charities, they very much need to start employing more people with visual impairment. And that's the first step, in my opinion. There is a lot more that they can do, but the first step that they can embrace is to employ more people. I would say probably 30-40% of their workforce being visually impaired. And the reason why that is because you can't possibly go into a company and talk about the benefits of employing visually impaired people when you don't employ visually impaired people yourself. You have no credibility with those organisations. And so the organisations aren't going to take on board what you're saying. So the first step they need to start is to employ more people with a visual impairment, and that be kind of their ethos. And then beyond that, then they can go into companies more and put it out there that these are all people who are perfectly capable of working for a living, and we employ them and they work in perfectly decent jobs within our charity, and therefore there is no reason why you shouldn't employ them. But if you don't employ them yourself, how can you possibly give that message to another company when you're trying to persuade them, oh, please employ these people? Well, we don't employ them, but, if you'd like to, that would be great. It just doesn't work, really.
I hope senior managers from the visual impairment charities and the Department for Employment are listening to that point in particular. It might help them greatly, I think. We'll move on to accessibility, Claire, because one of the things we spoke about, I think, when we chatted last week, was the problems that some IT systems present to visually impaired people. I remember when I was at the other Worcester in the Midlands in the UK, we thought then that information technology and computers would be the salvation for visually impaired people, that it would make jobs accessible and open up the employment market. Do you think it's done that for us? Do you think things like JAWS and other access technology have done that?
I think it has. I think it's a double-edged sword. I think on some levels it has. So there are jobs, things like secretarial jobs, finance jobs where you're using things like spreadsheets, typing jobs, Word, admin jobs. Those kind of jobs are more accessible. I think one of the issues that you have is that the technology, the access technology, doesn't keep up with the IT technology. So you know, Windows put out a new version every couple of years with huge changes, layout changes, and everything else like that. And the likes of JAWS don't always keep up with it. But similarly, a lot of companies have their own bespoke systems, and those aren't designed with accessibility in mind. And so at that point, you have to install JAWS and often start from scratch. And if it can't be made, if it's not accessible at the time, you might enter down the road of scripting and having a look and see how it can be made more accessible through essentially integrating JAWS rather than just installing it over the top. The job I applied for in October last year, October 2019, their system was Oracle. And Oracle are unfortunately renowned for their inaccessibility. In fact, I don't know many sighted people who like it. And sorry, is that going to get me sued?
Hopefully not. Hopefully not.
Anyway, yeah, so they were using Oracle, and Oracle is like an open-end. It's not like a database where you have tabs and things like that. It's all very much on the page, and it's not accessible at all. As soon as I plugged JAWS into it, it just froze. Didn't even say blank, blank, blank like JAWS does. It didn't echo anything back. It didn't do anything. And Oracle pretty much came back and said, no, sorry, we can't help you there. And so it wasn't meant to be. And the problem is that as soon as you have a system that has those incapabilities, you're pushing people out of that job market. that whole organization uses Oracle. When I had my offer withdrawn, I basically asked the question. I said, how can you now claim to be a disability confident employer when you now have to reject anyone who uses a screen reader because of the inaccessibility of your computer system? And they have now withdrawn their disability confident status, this particular company, which is a bit of a hollow victory, but it needed to be said and it needs to be done, in my opinion. What the ideal would be for them to work on, next time they work on a computer system, would be to think, oh, what happens if somebody needs to access it? Should we think about accessibility from the outset and then to bring that into place? But again, one of the problems is because there are so few blind and partially sighted people in work, you could put in that accessibility and you may never get another blind candidate.
If Oracle want to contact me, in whatever way they choose to put the other side of the story, they're welcome to. But the story you've just told to me there, Claire, you're not the only one. I've heard of other people who've lost jobs because systems didn't interface well with access technology, and it strikes me as being absolutely outrageous. I've had problems as well in a very well-known organisation with their systems not being accessible, so I can entirely empathise with the situation you found yourself in. So what's the future for you now? I mean, obviously we're in the middle of the third lockdown now. I'm guessing that nonetheless you're going to continue looking for work.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm looking for work. Anything that comes up, I'm hoping that there'll be more jobs come up in the next couple of months as companies run out to the end, the end of their financial year and start new budgets and new employment strategies. And I'm looking for that. I'm always looking down the route of self-employment. How can I make my skills work for me? And that's always a bit of a difficult one because self-employment isn't for everyone. But if I find that skill, then I shall utilize it for my benefit. But yes, very much looking for work and very much looking to be employed again. And again, the numbers of jobs are slightly limited. I can't go and work on Tesco's checkout because the cash registers aren't accessible. So I have to kind of still look at customer service and admin and those kinds of jobs. But yeah, hopefully something will come up, and hopefully this time next year we can catch up and I'll have a glittering career.
Let's hope so, and huge luck with that. Let's hope that works out for you. I was just going to say, Claire, that one thing that sighted people don't often realise is there are enormous numbers of jobs that just aren't available to us, such as even working on a checkout in a supermarket. Yeah,
very much so.
Just thinking about that a little bit further, Claire, as a sort of final thought, do you think sighted people generally need to have greater education and training on visual impairment and just being aware of the challenges that imposes upon us?
I think they do. I think you need to play it in a very different way, that you need to educate them in terms of the challenges that we have, while at the same time educating them into realizing that we do still have the same skill sets as many of them, because a lot of people that kind of almost seem to be in awe. Oh, she's blind, and that's what she can do. It's amazing. Whereas actually, if I wasn't blind, nobody would pay any attention to that. I would just do my job. And in the jobs where I've become settled, my blindness hasn't been an issue. People are quite used to who I am and what I do. Whereas when you walk into an interview, you have to convince them not only that you can do the job as somebody using greater accessibility and that accessibility should be made available, but you also have to convince them that if you can't see things that they can, then you still are as capable of doing the job as they are.
Well, Claire, thanks very much indeed for your time and your perspectives on employment, especially obviously for visually impaired people. And good luck with your future job search. I hope you find something very soon.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks very much for listening. And here's that treat I promised you. That'll Be the Day by Liverpool band The Vow.
I bless my inner visions of you. So what if that's a strange thing to do? My it just keeps leading me on. Down through the years, beating the way into your life, yeah, that'll be the day your open invitation comes my way. That'll be the day when all my inhibitions melt away. And who is not to say we'll raise the shallow wreck of yesterday, and I will love you if only I knew how. I've died too many times on this stage by slow hand of impending disgrace. The big wheel keeps turning, but I'm still learning to wind down on the way home. I'm out of the cold, out of the rain, and into your arms. Well, that'll be the day your open invitation comes my